Hello, welcome to Psych Minds. If you have not subscribed, do subscribe to the channel. We are reading The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, chapter 13. Of course, his mother killed him. I looked at the mouth of the boy Jody had wanted me to meet. His lips were thick and pink, and a baby face nestled under the silk of white blonde hair. His name was Cal, which I thought must be short for something, but I couldn't think what it would be short for unless it was California. How can you be so sure she killed him? I said. Cal was supposed to be very intelligent, and Jody had said over the phone that he was cute and I would like him. I wondered if I had been my old self, if I would have liked him. It was impossible to tell. Well, first she says, no, no, no. Then she says, yes. But then she says, no, no, again. Cal and I lay side by side on an orange and green striped towel on a mucky beach across the swamps from Lynn. Jody and Mark, the boy she was pinned to, were swimming. Cal hadn't wanted to swim, he had wanted to talk, and we were arguing about this play where a young man finds out he has a brain disease on account of his father fooling around with unclean women, and in the end, his brain, which has been softening all along, snaps completely, and his mother is debating whether to kill him or not. I had suspicion that my mother had called Jody and begged her to ask me out so I wouldn't sit around in my room all day with the shades drawn. I didn't want to go at first, but I thought Jody would notice a change in me and that anybody with half an eye would see I didn't have a brain in my head. But all during the drive north and then east, Jody had joked and laughed and chattered and not seemed to mind that I only said, my, or gosh, or you don't say. I browned hot dogs on the public grills at the beach, and by watching Jody and Mark and Cal very carefully, I managed to cook my hot dogs just the right amount of time and didn't burn it or drop it into the fire, the way I was afraid of doing. Then, when nobody was looking, I buried it in the sand. After we ate, Jody and Mark ran down to the water hand in hand, and I lay back staring into the sky, while Carl went on and on about this play. The only reason I remembered this play was because it had a mad person in it, and everything I had ever read about mad people stuck in my mind, while everything else flew out. But it's the yes that matters, Cal said. It's the yes she'll come back to in the end. I lifted my head and squinted out at the bright blue plate of the sea. A bright blue plate with a dirty rim. A big round grey rock like the upper half of an egg poked out of the water about a mile from the stony headland. What was she going to kill him with? I forget. I hadn't forgotten. I remembered perfectly well, but I wanted to hear what Cal would say. Morphia powders? Do you suppose they have morphia powders in America? Cal considered a minute, then he said, I wouldn't think so. They sounded awfully old fashioned. I rolled over onto my stomach and squinted at the view in the other direction towards Lynn. A glassy haze rippled up from the fires in the grills and the heat on the road, and through the haze, as through a curtain of clear water, I could make out a smudgy skyline of gas tanks and factory stacks and derricks and bridges. It looked one hell of a mess. I rolled onto my back again and made my voice casual. If you were going to kill yourself, how would you do it? Cal seemed pleased. I've often thought of that. I would blow my brains out with a gun. I was disappointed. It was just like a man to do it with a gun. A fat chance I had of laying my hands on a gun, and even if I did, I wouldn't have a clue as to what part of me would shoot at. I had already read in the papers about people who had tried to shoot themselves, only they end up shooting an important nerve and getting paralyzed, or blasting their face off but being saved by surgeons in a sort of miracle from dying outright. The risks of a gun seemed great. What kind of gun? My father's shotgun. He keeps it loaded. I would just have to walk into his study one day and Cal pointed a finger to his temple and made a comical, screwed up face. Click. He widened his pale grey eyes and looked at me. Does your father happen to live near Boston? I asked idly. Nope, in Clacton on Sea. He's English. Jody and Mark ran up hand in hand, dripping and shaking off water drops like two loving puppies. I thought there would be too many people, so I stood up and pretended to yawn. I guess I'll go for a swim. Being with Jody and Mark and Cal was beginning to weigh on my nerves, like a dull wooden block on the string of a piano. I was afraid that at any moment my control would snap, and I would start babbling about how I couldn't read and couldn't write, and how I must be just about the only person who had stayed awake for a solid month without dropping dead of exhaustion. A smoke seemed to be going up from my nerves like the smoke from the grills in the sun saturated road. The whole landscape, beach and headland and sea and rock, quavered in front of my eyes like a staged blackcloth. I wondered at what point in space the silly sham blue of sky turned black. You swim too, Cal? Gave Cal a playful little push. Oh! Cal hid his face in the towel. It's too cold. I started to walk towards the water. Somehow, in the broad, shadowless light of noon, the water looked amiable and welcoming. I thought drowning must be the kindest way to die, and burning the worst. Some of those babies in the jars that Buddy Willard showed me had gills. Gills, he said. They wanted they went through a stage where they were just like the fish. A little rubbishy wavelet full of candy wrappers and orange peel and seaweed folded over my foot. I heard the sand thud behind me and Cal came up. Let's swim to that rock out there. I pointed at it. Are you crazy? That's a mile out. What are you? I said. Chicken? Cal took me by the elbow and jostled me into the water when we were waist high. He pushed me under. I surfaced, splashing my eyes seared with salt. Underneath, the water was green and semi opaque as a hunk of quartz. I started to swim, a modified dog paddle keeping my face towards the rock. Cal did a slow crawl. After a while, he put his head up and treaded water. Can't make it, he was panting heavily. Okay, you go back. I thought I would swim out until I was too tired to swim back as I paddled on. My heartbeat boomed like a dull motor in my ears. I am, I am, I am. That morning, I had tried to hang myself. I had taken the silk cord of my mother's yellow bathrobe as soon as she left for work, and in the amber shade of the bedroom, fashioned it into a knot that slipped up and down on itself. It took me a long time to do this because I was poor at knots and had no idea how to make a proper one. Then I hunted around for a place to attach the rope. The trouble was, our house had the wrong kind of ceilings. The ceilings were low, white, and smoothly plastered without a light fixture or a wood beam inside. I thought with longing of the house my grandmother had before she sold it to come and live with us and then with my Aunt Libby. My grandmother's house was built in the fine 19th century style with lofty rooms and sturdy chandeliers, black brackets, and high closets with stout rails across them, and an attic where nobody ever went, full of trunks and parrot cages and dressmakers' dummies and overhead beams thick as a ship's timber. But it was an old house, and she had sold it, and I didn't know anybody else with a house like that. After a discouraging time of walking about with the silk cord dangling from my neck like a yellow cat's tail, and finding no place to fasten it, I sat on the edge of my mother's bed and tried pulling the cord tight. But each time I would get the cord so tight, I could feel a rushing in my ears and a flush of blood in my face. My hands would weaken and let go, and I would be all right again. Then I saw that my body had all sorts of little tricks, such as making my hands go limp at the crucial second, which would save it, time and again, whereas if I had the whole say, I would be dead in a flash. I would simply have to ambush it with whatever sense I had left, or it would trap me in its stupidest cage for 50 years without any sense at all. And when people found out my mind had gone, as they would have to sooner or later, in spite of my mother's guarded tongue, they would persuade her to put me into an asylum where I could be cured. Only my case was incurable. I had bought a few paperbacks on abnormal psychology at the drugstore and compared my symptoms with the symptoms in the book, and sure enough, my symptoms tallied with the most hopeless cases. The only thing I could read besides these scandal sheets were these abnormal psychology books. It was as if some slim opening had been left, so I could learn all I needed to know about my case to end it in the proper way. I wondered after the hanging fiasco if I shouldn't just give it up and turn myself over to the doctors, but then I remembered Dr. Gordon and his private shock machine. Once I locked up, they could use that on me all the time. And I thought of how my mother and brother and friends would visit me day after day, hoping I would be better. Then their visits would slacken off and they would give up hope. They would grow old, they would forget me, they would be poor too. They would want me to have the best of care at first, so they would sink all their money in a private hospital like Dr. Gordon's. Finally, when the money was used up, I would be moved to a state hospital with hundreds of people like me in a big cage in the basement. The more hopeless you were, the further away they hid you. Cal had turned around and was swimming in. As I watched, he dragged himself slowly out of the neck deep sea. Against the khaki colored sand and the green shore wavelets, his body was bisected for a moment like a white worm. Then it crawled completely out of the green and onto the khaki and lost itself among dozens and dozens of other worms that were wriggling or just lolling about between the sea and the sky. I paddled my hand in the water and kicked my feet. The egg shaped rock didn't seem to be any nearer than it had been when Carl and I had looked at it from the shore. Then I saw it would be pointless to swim as far as the rock because my body would take that excuse to climb out and lie in the sun, gathering strength to swim back. The only thing to do was to drown myself then and there, so I stopped. I brought my hands to my breast, dug my head, and dived, using my hands to push the water aside. The water pressed in on my eardrums and on my heart. I fanned myself down, but before I knew where I was, the water had spat me up into the sun, and the world was sparkling all about me like blue and green and yellow semi-precious stones. I dashed the water from my eyes. I was panting as after a strenuous exertion, but floating without effort. I dived and dived again, and each time popped up like a cock. The grey rock mocked me, bobbing on the water easy as a lifebuoy. I knew I was when I was beaten. I turned back. The flowers nodded like bright, knowledgeable children as I trundled them down the hall. I felt silly in my sage green volunteer's uniform and superfluous, unlike the white uniformed doctors and nurses or even the brown uniformed scrub women with their mops and their bucket of grimy water who passed me without a word. If I had been getting paid no matter how little, I could at least count this a proper job, but all I got from a morning of pushing round magazines and candy and flowers was a free lunch. My mother said the cure for thinking too much about yourself was helping somebody who was worse off than you. So Teresa had arranged for me to sign on and as a volunteer at our local hospital. It was difficult to be volunteer at this hospital because that's what all the junior league women wanted to do, but luckily for me, a lot of them were away on vacation. I had hoped they would send me to a ward with some really gruesome cases who would see through my dumb face to how I meant well and to be grateful. But the head of the volunteers, a society lady at our church, took one look at me and said, "You are on maternity." So I rode the elevator up 3 flights to the maternity ward and reported to the head nurse. She gave me the trolley of flowers. I was supposed to put the right vases at the right beds in the right rooms. But before I came to the door of the first room, I noticed that a lot of flowers were droopy and brown at the edges. I thought it would be discouraging for a woman who had just had a baby to see somebody plonk down a big bouquet of dead flowers in front of her. So I steered the trolley to a wash basin in a alcove in the hall and began to pick out all the flowers that were dead. Then I picked out those that were dying. There was no waste basket inside, so I crumpled the flowers up and laid them in the deep white basin. The basin felt cold as a tomb. I smiled. This must be how they laid the bodies away in the hospital morgue. My gesture, in its small way, echoed the larger gesture of the doctors and nurses. I swung the door of the first room open and walked in, dragging my trolley. A couple of nurses jumped up, and I had a confused impression of shelves and medicine cabinets. "What do you want?" one of the nurses demanded sternly. I couldn't tell one from the other. They all looked just alike. "I'm taking the flowers round." The nurse who had spoken put a hand on my shoulder and let me out of the room, maneuvering the trolley with her free, expert hand. She flung open the swinging doors of the room next to that one and bowed me in. Then she disappeared. I could hear giggles in the distance till a door shut and cut them off. There were 6 beds in the room, and each bed had a woman in it. The women were all sitting up and knitting or riffling through magazines or putting their hair in pin curls and chattering like parrots in a parrot house. I had thought they would be sleeping or lying quiet and pale, so I could tiptoe round without any trouble and match the bed numbers to the numbers inked on adhesive tape on the vases. But before I had a chance to get my bearings, a bright, jazzy blonde with a sharp, triangular face beckoned to me. I approached her, leaving the trolley in the middle of the floor, but then she made an impatient gesture and I saw she wanted me to bring the trolley too. I wheeled the trolley over to her bedside with a helpful smile. Hey, where's my larkspur? A large, flabby lady from across the ward raked me with her eagle eye. The sharp faced blonde bent over the trolley. Here are my yellow roses, she said, but they are all mixed up with some lousy iris. Other voices joined the voices of the first two women. They sounded cross and loud and full of complaint. I was opening my mouth to explain that I had thrown a bunch of dead larkspurs in the sink and that some of the vases I had weeded out looked skimpy. There were so few flowers left, so I had joined a few of the bouquets together to fill them out when the swinging door flew open and a nurse stalked in to see what the commotion was. Listen, nurse, I had this big bunch of larkspurs Larry brought last night. She's loused up my yellow roses. Unbuttoning the green uniform as I ran, I stuffed it, in passing, into the wash basin with the rubbish of dead flowers. Then I took the deserted side steps down to the street, two at a time and without meeting another soul. Which way is the graveyard? The Italian in the black leather jacket stopped and pointed down an alley behind the white Methodist church. I remembered the Methodist church. I had been a Methodist for the first 9 years of my life before my father died and we moved and turned Unitarian. My mother had been a Catholic before she was a Methodist. My grandmother and my grandfather and my Aunt Libby were all still Catholics. My Aunt Libby had broken away from the Catholic Church at the same time my mother did, but then she had fallen in love with an Italian Catholic, so she had gone back again. Lately, I had considered going into Catholic Church myself. I knew that Catholics thought killing yourself was an awful sin, but perhaps if this was so they might have a good way to persuade me out of it. Of course, I didn't believe in life after death, or the virgin birth, or the Inquisition, or the infallibility of that little monkey faced Pope, or anything. But I didn't have to let the priest see this. I could just concentrate on my sin, and he would help me repent. The only trouble was, church, even the Catholic Church, didn't take up the whole of your life. No matter how much you knelt and prayed, you still had to eat 3 meals a day and have a job and live in the world. I thought I might see how long you had to be Catholic before you became a nun. So I asked my mother, thinking she would know the best way to go about it. My mother had laughed at me. Do you think they will take somebody like you right off the bat? Why you have got to know all these catechism and credos and believe in them? Lock, stock and barrel? A girl with your sense. Still, I imagined myself going to some Boston priest. It would have to be Boston because I didn't want any priest in my hometown. No, I had thought of killing myself. Priests were terrible gossips. I would be in black with my dead white face and I would throw myself at this priest's feet and say, "Oh, Father, help me." But that was before people had begun to look at me in a funny way, like those nurses in the hospital. I was pretty sure the Catholics wouldn't take in any crazy nuns. My Aunt Libby's husband had made a joke once about a nun that a nunnery sent to Teresa for a checkup. This nun kept hearing harp notes in her ears and a voice saying over and over, "Alleluia." Only she wasn't sure, on being closely questioned, whether the voices was saying Alleluia or Arizona. The nun had been born in Arizona. I think she ended up in some asylum. I tucked my black veil down to my chin and strode in through the wrought iron gates. I thought it odd that in all the time my father had been buried in this graveyard, none of us had ever visited him. My mother hadn't let us come to his funeral because we were only children then, and he had died in the hospital, so the graveyard and even his death had always seemed unreal to me. I had a great yearning lately to pay my father back for all the years of neglect and start tending his grave. I had always been my father's favorite, and it seemed fitting I should take on a mourning my mother had never bothered with. I thought that if my father hadn't died, he would have taught me all about insects, which was his specialty at the university. He would also have taught me German and Greek and Latin, which he knew, and perhaps I would be a Lutheran. My father had been a Lutheran in Wisconsin, but they were out of style in New England, so he had become a lapsed Lutheran, and then my mother said, a bitter atheist. The graveyard disappointed me. It lay at the outskirts of the town on low ground like a rubbish dump, and as I walked up and down the gravel paths, I could smell the stagnant salt marshes in the distance. The old part of the graveyard was all right, with its worn, flat stones and lichen bitten monuments, but I soon saw my father must be buried in the modern part with dates in the 1940s. The stones in the modern part were crude and cheap, and here and there a grave was rimmed with marble like an oblong bathtub full of dirt and rusty metal containers stuck up about where the person's navel would be, full of plastic flowers. A fine drizzle started drifting down from the grey sky, and I grew very depressed. I couldn't find my father anywhere. Low, shaggy clouds scudded over the part of the horizon where the sea lay, behind the marshes and the beach shanty settlements, and raindrops darkened the black mackintosh I had brought that morning. A clammy dampness sank through to my skin. I had asked the sales girl, "Is it water repellent?" And she had said, "No raincoat is ever water repellent, it's shower proofed." And when I asked her what showerproofed was, she told me I had better buy an umbrella. But I hadn't enough money for an umbrella, with bus fare in and out of Boston and peanuts and newspaper and abnormal psychology books and trips to my old hometown by the sea. My New York fund was almost exhausted. I had decided that when there were no money in my bank account, I would do it. And that morning, I had spent the last of it on the black raincoat. Then I saw my father's gravestone. It was crowded right up by another gravestone, head to head, the way people are crowded in a charity ward when there isn't enough space. The stone was of a molded pink marble like tinned salmon, and all there was on it was my father's name, and under it, two dates, separated by a little dash. At the foot of the stone, I arranged the rainy armful of azaleas I had picked from a bush at the gateway of the graveyard. Then my legs folded under me, and I sat down in the sopping grass. I couldn't understand why I was crying so hard. Then I remembered that I had never cried for my father's death. My mother hadn't cried either. She had just smiled and said what a merciful thing it was for him he had died, because if he had lived, he would have been crippled and an invalid for life, and he couldn't have stood that. He would rather have died than had that happen. I laid my face to the smooth face of the marble and howled my loss into the cold salt rain. I knew just how to go about it. The minute the car tires crunched off down the drive and the sound of the motor faded, I jumped out of bed and hurried into my white blouse and green figured skirt and black raincoat. The raincoat felt damp still from the day before, but that would soon cease to matter. I went downstairs and picked up a pale blue envelope from the dining room table and scrawled on the back in large painstaking letter, "I'm going for a long walk." I propped the message where my mother would see it in the minute she came in. Then I laughed. I had forgotten the most important thing. I ran upstairs and dragged a chair into my mother's closet. Then I climbed up and reached for the small green strong box on the top shelf. I could have torn the metal cover off with my bare hands. The lock was so feeble, but I wanted to do things in a calm, orderly way. I pulled out my mother's upper right hand bureau drawer and slipped the blue jewelry box from its hiding place under the scented Irish linen handkerchiefs. I unpinned the little key from the dark velvet. Then I unlocked the strong box and took out the bottle of new pills. There were more than I had hoped. There were at least 50. If I had waited until my mother doled them out to me night by night, it would have taken me 50 nights to save up enough. and in 15 nights, college would have opened, and my brother would have come back from Germany, and it would be too late. I pinned the key back in the jewelry box among the clutter of inexpensive chains and rings, put the jewelry box back in the drawer under the handkerchief, returned the strong box to the closet shelf, and set the chair on the rug in the exact spot I had dragged it from. Then I went downstairs and into the kitchen. I turned on the tap and poured myself a tall glass of water. Then I took the glass of water and the bottle of pills and went down into cellar. A dim undersea light filtered through the slits of the cellar windows. Behind the oil burner, a dark gap showed in the wall at about shoulder height and ran back under the breezeway out of sight. The breezeway had been added to the house after the cellar was dug and built out over the secret earth-bottomed crevice. A few old rotting fireplace logs blocked the whole mouth. I shoved them back a bit, then I set the glass of water and bottle of pills side by side on the flat surface of one of the logs and started to heave myself up. It took me a good while to heft my body into the gap, but at last, after many tries, I managed it and crouched at the mouth of the darkness like a troll. The earth seemed friendly under my bare feet, but cold. I wondered how long it had been since this particular square of soil had seen the sun. Then, one after the other, I lugged the heavy, dust-covered logs across the whole mouth. The dark felt thick as velvet. I reached for the glass and bottle, and carefully on my knees, with bent head, crawled to the farthest wall. Cobwebs touched my face with the softness of moths, wrapped my black coat round me like my own sweet shadow. I unscrewed the bottle of pills and started taking them swiftly, between gulps of water, one by one. At first nothing happened, but as I approached the bottom of the bottle, red and blue lights began to flash before my eyes. The bottle slid from my fingers and I lay down. The silence drew off, bearing the pebbles and shells and all the tatty wreckage of my life. Then, at the rim of the vision, it gathered itself, and in one sweeping tide, rushed me to sleep. That brings us to the end of chapter 13. We will continue with chapter 14 in our next reading. If you like, share, and subscribe. Bye bye for now. Take care. Keep reading. If there is any comment, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the YouTube channel. Bye bye. Stay tuned for the next reading.